Good. Okay. Sveta, you're still muted.
Yes. Hello, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you also to Ben and Nick for organizing this event. I'm very happy to be here. And today I'm going to talk to you about Tolstoy's 1861 visit to London. So I'd like to just begin by admitting quite frankly to you that there's not very much information on Tolstoy's 1861 visit to London. Nevertheless, what has come down to us can help us form a pretty clear picture of how the visit contributed to his views on England, its culture, and its people, especially when considered in context of his other European travels and pedagogical activities. So the 1861 trip was the third and last of Tolstoy's trips abroad. He traveled little for a Russian aristocrat of the time, and when we consider his attitude to foreigners, particularly European foreigners, it'll hopefully become somewhat clearer why that is. So I'll begin by discussing Tolstoy's first two journeys abroad, the first briefly and the second in much more detail, because as I hope to show, his experiences during these trips helped contextualize and help us understand his subsequent complicated attitude to England. So his first journey abroad took place during his service in the Crimean War in the summer of 1854, when he was stationed for several months in various towns and communes near Bucharest. All we really know about that time can be gathered from his sparse journal entries. They indicate that when he wasn't trying to write the short story Rubka Lesa, the woodfelling, he spent most of his time there occupied with reading Lermontov, gambling, pursuing a certain mysterious Zemfira. So at the beginning of the siege of Sevastopol in November 1854, on the way from Odessa to Sevastopol, he encountered French and English prisoners of war. He observed them closely and made the following remark in his journal. I saw French and English prisoners, but didn't have time to speak with them. Just the look and gait of these people somehow instilled in me the sad conviction that they stand much higher than our forces. So he wants to interact with these foreigners he's encountering in masses for the first time, but he sees them as somehow superior to the Russian military. And a few weeks later, the suspicion is confirmed for Tolstoy when he actually interacts with wounded French and English soldiers. He writes, I spent 2 hours chatting with the wounded French and English. Each soldier is proud of his position, values himself, for he feels himself to be an important component of the military. Excellent weapons, the art of using them, youth, general understanding of politics, give him a sense of his own dignity. And then Tolstoy compares the Russian soldier in comparison. Our troops, right, they have useless weapons, submissiveness, old age, lack of education. It kills the last spark of pride. So, of course, one of the primary outcomes for the Russian Empire after the Crimean War was that word got out that the Russian military was vastly inferior to its European rivals. And Tolstoy is witnessing this inferiority firsthand. However, what we should pay attention to is that he picks up on this sense of what he calls dignity and importance that the French and English soldiers possess that's in his experience lacking in the humble, ill-equipped, and ill-fed Russian soldier. They have a knowledge of politics, he says. What he's picking up on, of course, is the more liberal, individualistic approach that was developing in Europe after the mid-19th century revolutions. So in December, he visits the tent where the wounded allies are being tended to, where he witnesses a striking scene. I found 5 of them, he writes, by the metal stove, French, English, Russians, chatting, laughing, playing cards, each chatting in his own language. So we can see some of this experience of being curious about the enemy and the friendly sort of rivalry associated with it eventually make its way a decade later into War and Peace, in that particularly charming scene when Dolokhov is chatting across the picket line with the French grenadier, and each is trying to prove to the other that their military is superior. It's a moment that completely humanizes the enemy. So for our purposes, we just need to note that at 26 years old, Tolstoy seems to have a very positive, fully humane view of French and English soldiers, comparing them favorably and even enviously to the Russian troops. So a few years later, in 1857, at the age of 29, Tolstoy is already becoming well known in Russia for the Sevastopol sketches and childhood, and he takes a train journey to Paris, where he will spend nearly 2 months. Now, when Tolstoy's biographers, like Ian Wilson, Rosamund Bartlett, when they mention this 1857 trip, it's merely a sort of passing reference to operas, balls, perpetual squabbles with the writer Ivan Turgenev, who's also residing in the city at the time. And certainly for Tolstoy, there were no shortages of operas and balls, good dose of sexual temptation mixed in. But what's generally left out of the biographical sketch is the seriousness with which Tolstoy participated in the educational offerings of the city. So he regularly is attending lectures at the Sorbonne and the Collège de France on philosophy and history, particularly focusing on Greco-Roman antiquity, and even meeting privately with tutors for Italian and Latin language studies. Now, in the turbulent years of the Second French Empire, there were efforts in France, led by Victor Duruy, who's a historian politician, to introduce free and mandatory education. It was a very controversial position at the time. Napoleon III rejected it. The statesman Frederick Alfred Pierre de Falloux, he was one of the leaders of these educational reforms. And Tolstoy knew about him. He went to see the induction of de Falloux into the Académie Française on March 26 in 1857. It's a very lengthy affair, these induction ceremonies. So it demonstrates that he really cared about being there. And he was struck by the dramatic contrast between the Russian and French attitudes to culture and education. And he regarded the social values that de Falloux praised in his induction speech very highly, not least for their tendency to facilitate reflective self-improvement. A week after de Falloux's induction, Tolstoy enthusiastically explains in a letter to the writer Elisée Kolbasin precisely why travel is so essential for Russians, specifically to Europe, citing that experiencing social freedom is, quote, the main charm of life in Europe. So at this point, Tolstoy is comparing Europeans very favorably to Russians, in great part due to the social freedoms that they have. And then in April, something happens, a sort of bout of homesickness sets in, or something like homesickness. In April, Tolstoy begins to grow weary of his idleness in Paris and impatient with French scholarship. After meeting several of them in a cafe, he describes them and the life in the French capital as, quote, shallow, vulgar, stupid. A week later, he notes, he's feeling sorrow of which he can't rid himself. He soon ceases to visit the Sorbonne and the Collège de France for several weeks, even avoiding meetings with Turgenev. At last, he writes, with a determined finality, disillusionment. I've become disillusioned. There is no poetry here and no poetic tradition either. So he's having a sense of loneliness, he's disillusioned, and then something happens that I think really kind of defines his attitude to European culture for the rest of his life. April 6, 1857, in front of a crowd of 12,000 to 15,000 people, a certain Francis Richoux, who had been found guilty of robbery and murder, was executed by guillotine. Tolstoy, who went to go see the event, was deeply shocked. He writes in his journal, went to see an execution, thick, white, healthy neck and chest. Kissed the gospel and then death, what senselessness. Strong impression, not to be taken for granted. I'm not a political person. And he's sort of referencing what's important to him, morality and art. That's what he loves. But suddenly, I don't feel well. I'm sad. The guillotine prevented me from sleeping for a long time, making me look round. So it didn't help that 2 weeks prior to the execution, the weather in Paris was really bad. It's raining all the time, and Tolstoy was really not feeling well. He wrote to his friend, the Russian literary critic Vasily Botkin, the day after the event, that he had seen many terrible things in the Caucasus during the war. But if he had witnessed a human being torn to pieces before him, it would have been, quote, less revolting than this aesthetic and elegant machine, which in a single instant killed a strong, fresh, healthy human being. And Tolstoy was particularly upset by the people in the crowd. Apparently, he saw a father explaining to his daughter how conveniently the machine operates. Now, for context, in the 1750s, so almost 100 years before, the Empress Elizaveta Petrovna had sharply limited the legal scope of capital punishment in Russia. So for 70 years before 1845, only about a dozen people were executed on court orders in the Russian Empire. This is accepting the Pugashovщина. And so for several decades before 1845, capital punishment was a very exceptional measure. From 1826 to 1905, 525 people are executed in Russia, so in 80 years. All that sounds obviously like a lot to us, but we have to compare that to the number of executions in England and Wales, where the yearly number of executions in the first decades of the 19th century was just under 100, before falling to 10 a year in the late 1830s. And the numbers were much higher in France. Also, the French Penal Code in the early decades of the 19th century made it acceptable to amputate a parricide's right hand. So in Russia, such punishments were made illegal long before. So Tolstoy's shock is genuine. And the experience tormented him for the rest of his life. He referred to it in his confessions 25 years later, explaining that the horror of it thoroughly undermined any faith he had nurtured in the idea of progress, particularly European progress. So the French capital, so full of seductive promise to a 19th century Russian aristocracy dreaming of liberal reforms, became for Tolstoy a place of inhuman cruelty. The day following the execution, Tolstoy resolves to leave Paris. Soon after, he arrives in Switzerland, in Geneva, and Tolstoy expresses relief in an unsent letter to Turgenev that he left Sodom, Paris, where so much filth had collected on his soul, citing specifically the guillotine. And to Botkin, he wrote that he left Paris due to various moral reasons. A month later in June, after his tour Geneva and Bern, he sent Botkin a letter from Lucerne in Switzerland, and it contains a draft of his short story, aptly titled Lucerne. That was part of the reading for today's talk. And I chose a draft version of the story because in being less polished and less professional, it's likely closer to Tolstoy's actual experience of the event. Now, the city of Lucerne was attractive for 19th century Russian writers, and from Zhukovsky to Turgenev to Herzen, they all came to marvel at the Lion Monument and wander the medieval streets. In his journal, Tolstoy noted that Lucerne had its fair share of Anglichanie, English, travelers, and he seems to get extremely upset, and not just upset, but actually enraged at the indifference that these English travelers, specifically English travelers, display to sort of wandering rhapsode, a singing beggar. In his journal, Tolstoy describes a verbal altercation between himself and other tourists who, according to him, were mocking both the singer and Tolstoy's rather unprecedented decision to bring this wandering beggar to a very expensive, sophisticated restaurant of the Schweizerhof Hotel. That's the hotel there at the top. And even today, if you want to spend the night where Tolstoy did, you can stay there for a mere $375 a night. So the plot of Lucerne is really simple. It's a first-person narrative, opens with a description of how foreigners gather one summer in the tourist town of Lucerne. The English are particularly plentiful. Near the Schweizerhof Hotel, the protagonist hears very beautiful guitar music and singing issuing from a street performer who requests some money after his performance from the audience that's gathered there. The audience members only laugh and go on with their evening. The main hero invites the singer, who's dressed in rags, for a drink to the Schweizerhof Hotel, where the singer tells his life story, while the employees of the restaurant laugh at the hero and the poor reformer. So let's go to the text of the draft and the letter to Botkin and look at a few key moments. So, for every 100 travelers, there are 99 English. Thanks to the tremendous incursion of the English, their tastes, and their money, the bridge has been replaced with a quay, straight as a stick. This is the promenade, and the Englishwomen with Swiss straw hats and long red faces stroll here, along with Englishmen in durable tights, rejoicing at what they have created. Perhaps these quays and houses and lindens and Englishmen are all very good, but not here, among this powerful, strange, and inexpressibly harmonious and tender nature. Describing the process of dining among these English tourists, Tolstoy writes about how these good-looking and well-dressed people interact during the ceremony. What is astonishing that these 40, 50 people, for the duration of an hour and 8 courses, sit and eat, obviously trying to eat as elegantly as possible. They're all dead, literally dead. If I've heard a single living word, let all disasters of the world befall me. So there's a lot of exaggeration and satirical humor here, but also a great deal of pathos, as we have developed here one of the earliest instances of what will become one of Tolstoy's trademark themes, the opposition between civilization and nature and the simple natural way of life that's suppressed for the corrupt tastes and amusements of civilization, here represented by unfortunate English tourists. Significantly, this trip to Lucerne follows very closely on Tolstoy's traumatic experience of slick and modern civilization in Paris, as represented by the guillotine. And I think that what happens here is that somehow the blame for the inhumanity of corrupting civilization is transferred to the English in this story. When the tourists fail to reward the singer, the narrator recalls the violence of warfare when he remarks, "I think I would have happily fought the footman and clubbed over the head the Englishwoman on the balcony. If Sevastopol, where anger can be released, were to last forever, I would have at this moment been horrifying, ужасен." Now remember, when writing about the guillotine to Botkin, he had also compared it to the horrors of war. Civilization for Tolstoy, whether in central Paris or in a small town in Switzerland, is inherently violent. And he adds snidely, "Your mangy republic, here's the equality of these English." So I think we should take all of this really seriously. Tolstoy really did get into a heated argument with foreign tourists that threatened to become a violent fight at this elegant hotel. His rage that begun in Paris at the hypocrisy that's concealed by beautiful clothing and manners vents itself in violence at what the narrator takes to be human cruelty seething beneath the rhetoric of progress, civilization that's usually associated with England, Paris, and the European world. So immediately after his experience of the guillotine, Tolstoy makes this link in 1857 between the inhumanity of the French and the inhumanity of the English, made manifest in his writing. Now, importantly, this link is sustained, if not for the rest of his life, It's at least so for at least the next third of a century. So let's jump forward in time a little bit to see how that happens. In 1891, Tolstoy was visited on his estate, Yasna Polyana, by one of his first translators into English, the American writer Isabel Florence Hapgood. Now, by this point, Tolstoy is famous enough in England and in the States that the reading public is interested in his views and his life. Hapgood published an article in The Atlantic titled Count Tolstoy at Home that recounts her experience of staying at Yasna Polyana, interacting with Tolstoy and Sofia Tolstaya. If you haven't read it, it's really wonderful, very funny. She argues with him. It's really good writing. And the following interesting exchange takes place between Tolstoy and Hapgood. They start talking about the English, and he says, the English are the most brutal nation on earth, along with the Zulus, that is to say. Both go naked, the Zulus all day long, the Englishwomen as soon as dinner is served. The English worship their muscle, they think of it, talk of it. If I had time, I should like to write a book on their ways. And then their executions, which they go to see as a pleasure. An Englishman, if he were to cut the throat of his own father and eat him, he would do it. Now, two things stand out in Tolstoy's rather incoherent and dramatic rhetoric here. First, the statement regarding the Zulu people. It's obviously very bigoted, but I think it ought to be qualified a bit. It was uttered in the wake of the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. Tolstoy was an ardent critic of English policy in both India and Africa, specifically citing in his journal in 1895 the destruction of nationalities in Africa by the English. In 1897, he refers specifically to the British annexation of Zululand, writing in his journal, I was reading of the British actions in Africa. It's all horrible. Ужасно. In 1900, he told one of his interviewers that he was following the events of the Second Boer War in South Africa, and that he ardently wished to read in the paper each day that the Boers defeated the English, adding that this, quote, highly civilized nation, England, so proud of the title of a free country, is trying to destroy the small number of Boers who did not do the English any harm, end quote. The same year that he tells Hapgood that the English are no better than the Zulus, 1891, he reflects in his journal on an observation made by the French linguist and philosopher Ernest Renan in The Future of Science, that killing, whom he terms barbarians, is not ethically problematic because, in Renan's words, he possesses much less value than civilized man. Renan says that the death of a Frenchman is a moral fact, while the death of a Cossack is only a physiological fact. And Tolstoy writes, this is what the Englishman thinks of the Negro and the Indian. So here Tolstoy takes Renan's national exceptionalism as applied to the Cossacks, whom Tolstoy respected, admired, and even loved, and finds its equivalent in the attitude of the English to the people that they had colonized in Africa and India. Tolstoy is making a direct link between the injustices of the French and those of the English. So in my view, Tolstoy's statement to Hapgood indicates not his critique of Zulu people, but rather that the English are hypocrites. Maybe that's a bit of wishful acrobatics on my part, but I think the point overall is that for Tolstoy, the English display with their actions in Africa and India that they are intolerant, violent, and cruel, despite the rhetoric of liberal progress with which they're associated at the time. Now, second, what I think this accusation of English brutality to Hapgood shows, I think I see that Tolstoy has literally transferred to the English not only the sin of oppressing nature that they were allegedly guilty of committing in Lucerne, but somehow by 1891, they're also guilty of the sin of public executions and enjoying them. Now, we'll remember, he had actually witnessed this in Paris. Of course, public execution was practiced in England until well into the 20th century. And interestingly, the very year that Tolstoy visited London, in 1861, was the last year when a person was hanged for attempted murder in England. However, Tolstoy witnessed execution in Paris, not London. So why does he tell Hapgood that the English are violent cannibals who love to watch executions? Now, to attempt to answer the question, let's find out what actually happened during Tolstoy's final trip abroad. So the reason you're all here, he began the journey in 1860. The failing health of his brother, Nikolai, brought Tolstoy to Sodden by way of Berlin and Dresden, where he took the opportunity to visit schools. Now, around this time, this is Tolstoy around this time, 1860, Tolstoy develops the notion that he would like to start a private school of his own for peasant children at Yasna Polyana. So he's reading a lot of books and articles on pedagogy and taking inspiration and information from the European education system. In Kissingen, he makes the observations in his journal that the schools he visited are oppressive. Prayer for the king, thrashings, everything learned by heart, frightened, tormented children. Now, Tolstoy was really progressive in his views on education, emphasizing the individuality and creativity of students, both boys and girls, regardless of their economic background, arguing that both equality and freedom are to be the most important criteria of any pedagogical philosophy. During his stay in France with his family, in September of 1860, his brother Nikolai died. And the loss of his brother was very difficult for Tolstoy, and he plunged headlong into his pedagogical investigations, writing to his aunt in 1860 that this is the only interest that still attaches him to life. And he writes to his other aunt that he's in a great hurry to visit certain schools in Europe, for his школьные занятия, school-related affairs. So for that purpose, in autumn of 1860, he traveled to Italy, where he visited Florence, Livorno, Naples, and Rome. By February of 1861, he's back in France, visiting schools in Marseille, sending cartons of textbooks back to Russia, and preparing for his London journey. He writes at this time to his brother Sergei about the goal of his travels, that his primary aim in traveling is that nobody in Russia would dare to point out to me the pedagogical methods of foreign lands, to be au niveau, or abreast of all that occurs at this period. Now, if you read the article by Knowles that was part of the recommended reading, the date of Tolstoy's departure to London has been more or less established as March 1st, and his arrival there is March 2nd. So let's imagine him crossing the English Channel in a ferry, probably from Calais to Dover, crossing which takes a few hours, and which, according to Charles Dickens, who made the crossing very frequently in the 1850s and 1860s, could sometimes induce a bout of seasickness. And indeed, this is exactly what happens to Tolstoy. Recollecting his voyage across the Channel in 1804, he said, "When in 1860 I traveled to London, something very strange happened to me in the Channel, and importantly, it was so sudden that I immediately," he looks around and smiles and adds, "he paid tribute to the sea." So this bout of seasickness was apparently so ill-received among the passengers in the ferry that Tolstoy recalls one of the sailors approaching him and telling him that his behavior was not appropriate. Now, this detail may be trivial, and yet Tolstoy remembers it nearly half a century later, which indicates that the journey and the symbolic crossing of the Channel made a deep and lasting impression on him. The seasickness is also the beginning of Tolstoy's general ill health in London, it seems, for the majority of his stay. A week after his arrival, he writes to his brother Sergei on March 9th. "I arrived in London a week ago where I have so much to do, and from the day of my arrival, I'm tormented by my teeth as I've not been tormented in a long time. Probably there's an infection somewhere. This entire week, I've not seen or read what I would have done in one day." So his health is otherwise good, or as well as it can be, with sleepless nights and fever. So poor Tolstoy arrives in England hanging over the side of a ferry, and then proceeds to sleep badly for more than a week, suffering from terrible toothache. Now, if we recall the typical weather in London in early March, we can say that to some extent, this really is a reiteration of his experience in Paris, in the sense that the weather's terrible, Tolstoy is not feeling well. I really think we should take seriously the supposition that the somatic experience colors to a great degree his experience of the city. Now, how long he remained in London is not altogether clear. In March, he wrote to Sergei that he spent 20 days in the city. During an interview some decades later, he recalls that he was there for 6 weeks. After examining the dates on letters that Tolstoy and Turgenev exchanged during this time, Knowles arrives at the conclusion that Tolstoy spent a little more than 2 weeks in London, from the 2nd to the 17th of March. So what exactly did he do there? It seems that he didn't exaggerate when he said that he spent his first week in London doing nothing. He had begun visiting the Athenaeum Club in Pall Mall a few days after his arrival. It's a prestigious private club to which he obtained an honorary membership. There's very little information on Tolstoy's visits there, but it seems that he was hoping to run into the British novelist Thackeray in the Pall Mall Club, which is what Tolstoy called the Athenaeum Club. He said that he had the opportunity of meeting Thackeray almost daily, but disappointingly failed to obtain an introduction. Now, we have to keep in mind that in 1861, Tolstoy was completely unknown to the English-speaking world. The first translations in England of Childhood and Youth were made in 1862. So although he had been furnished by a distant relation with a letter of introduction into what Tolstoy described as the heart of literary and aristocratic circles in London, which is what enabled him to attend the Athenaeum Club, so he was certainly not the celebrity that he would become just a few decades later, when Tolstoy communes began springing up all over England following the translations of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. So upon recovering from his toothache, one of Tolstoy's first activities was to visit the House of Commons on the morning of March 11th, 9 days after his arrival. He did not seem to be particularly impressed with the workings of the English Parliament. In an 1875 letter to his friend, the poet Afanasy Fet, Tolstoy wrote, "I listened to speeches in the English Parliament. After all, this is considered very important, and I felt that it was boring and insignificant." The speech Tolstoy heard was delivered by the Prime Minister at the time, Henry John Temple Palmerston. Their subject seems to have been proposed by Knowles to be the riveting one of the sizes of the French and British navies. So this is not terribly interesting, but the impression Lord Palmerston made did lead Tolstoy to include a caricature of him in a short story, Polikushka, where the unnamed narrator compares the relationship of the English Prime Minister with his political opposition to that of an estate manager and the noblewoman who owns the estate. On the same day, after visiting the House of Commons, Tolstoy possibly met Matthew Arnold, the English Victorian poet and literary critic. As professor of poetry at Oxford, Arnold was one of the figures to whom Tolstoy obtained a letter of introduction in his efforts to learn about the English education system. Now, a note survives from Arnold, dated March 11, 1861, which served as a letter of introduction for Tolstoy to visit several London schools, 7 of them specifically. Arnold describes Tolstoy as a gentleman from Russia interested in English schools and adds that Tolstoy is particularly desirous of learning about the methods of teaching natural sciences. Now, while Tolstoy's biographers such as Rosamund Bartlett, Nikolai Gusev, and Arnold scholars like Clinton McCann indicate on the strength of this letter that Tolstoy and Arnold did meet briefly in London, when Arnold gave Tolstoy the note, presumably, Tolstoy records no such meeting, either in his journals or his letters. And significantly, none of the interviews that he gave or conversations he had in subsequent years reference such a meeting. He greatly admired Arnold's work, and of course, Arnold wrote extensively in praise of Tolstoy's writing, did not mention a meeting. So they may have met, they may not. I like to think they did. Now, whether Tolstoy toured the 7 schools that Arnold's letter entitled him to isn't clear. We know that Tolstoy visited St. Mark's College in Chelsea on March 12, 1861, so the next day, where he met the boys of class 3B, whom he asked to write essays for him, which survived to this day. Tolstoy described in his pedagogical article how, during his visit, he witnessed an object lesson. Now, object lessons were a typical feature of the Victorian primary school curriculum, in which a teacher would encourage children to observe an object presented to them and to describe it carefully. They're supposed to come up with the adjectives to describe it by themselves, while the teacher guided the students to the correct observation. So here's an example of an object lesson on pepper. So the object lesson at St. Mark's on March 12, 1861, when the Russian gentleman came, was dedicated to cotton. The students were asked questions such as, how is cotton made? Where is it made? How does it arrive in the factory? Tolstoy remarks that the students answered these questions correctly. Then he requested to ask the children a few questions himself. And he asked, what is the class of plants to which cotton belongs? What sort of soil does it require? How much does a cubic foot of cotton weigh after folding it? How much does transportation, loading, and unloading cost? What are the chemical components of cotton? What happens to cotton when it is wet? And what was the impact on the working class of the introduction and use of cotton? Tolstoy was surprised and disappointed that the students could not answer these very simple questions, which, as Tolstoy remarks, any worker of a cotton factory could have answered easily. He argues in his article that the boys' inability to answer his questions is evidence that the object lessons do not effectively teach anything that's actually important about the object that they purport to study, instead drilling the students about what the teacher himself wanted them to know. Now, Tolstoy proposes a thought experiment. He says, if you take any object, a piece of bread, for example, and begin describing it the way the object lesson requires you to do, your description ought to touch upon all the disciplines, chemistry, history, geography, economics. There are no limits or borders between these disciplines, and the instructor's role is to convey the intersection of these many knowledges in a way that is pleasurable and interesting for a child. So Tolstoy is saying education should be fun. He's anticipating the Montessori school by quite a lot here, and he criticizes the London object lessons as resulting, quote, only in the students' obedient memorization, end quote. So in great part on the strength of these negative impressions, Tolstoy continued developing his school at Yasna Polyana in May of 1861, a month after his return from abroad, and he established 21 schools by that autumn. The method of instruction is based on complete freedom for students, did not require any of the memorization that Tolstoy had so disapproved of in Germany and in England, and held classes in the form of a dialogue between instructors and students. In the following year, he started a journal dedicated to articles on pedagogy and educational reform in Russia, titled Yasna Polyana. In one of the journal's first issues, we get a glimpse into how Tolstoy spent a good deal of his time in London. We learn that he claims to have visited the Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert Museum, every day of his stay in London. He describes it in the following way. The Kensington Museum is based on commercial calculations. I will try to describe it briefly. Near Hyde Park, you'll notice that he misspells Hyde Park, which is charming. A huge barracks has been constructed. On certain days, you visit it for free. On others, you pay. And regarding the question of what is in this barracks, the answer is everything. All the European textbooks in one library. You'll see a student, you'll meet a worker or a factory worker who has arrived to examine a machine, prim ladies touring the picture gallery. The museum is rich in its pedagogical library, educational collections, maps, instruments, paintings for visual instructions and models. Not one society with the aim of education has delivered 1/100th of the usefulness which this one has. And it's all based on commercial calculation, not the love of the narod. I must admit that upon leaving London, after living in the museum for a month, I still had much to see and learn. So this extract was part of the reading for today, and I included it for 2 reasons. First, it helps us contextualize Tolstoy's visit. Certainly, you'll see that Tolstoy claims to have spent a month in London here, not 20 days, not 6 weeks, but exactly a month, which is, according to Knowles' calculations at least, an enormous exaggeration. More importantly, however, this description of the Kensington Museum forms part of Tolstoy's response to the work of the Komitet Gramotnosti, or the Literacy Committee, a division of the Imperial Free Economic Society established in St. Petersburg and Moscow in 1861 after the emancipation of the serfs, dedicated to the philanthropic efforts to disseminate education in Russia. So we can see that Tolstoy is praising, but also subtly critiquing the English Museum, praising it for its contents and its ability to provide an unstructured, sort of free-roaming laboratory experience to every class of society, from factory workers to noblewomen. And he's subtly intimating that it has purely commercial interests at heart, right? So for Tolstoy, commercial interests are a much more suspect basis for any venture than is the love of Narod. What he's indicating here, I think, is that wandering in this unstructured way through the museum's multidisciplinary, secular, and disinterested displays and galleries facilitates education in a way that the bureaucratic literacy committee, in all its formal officialdom and centralization of knowledge, cannot, despite its purported and hypocritical love for the people. So, aside from his visits to schools and the museums, it's probable that Tolstoy attended a reading Charles Dickens gave on March 14th at St. James Hall, Piccadilly, of A Christmas Carol and Boots at the Holly Tree Inn. In 1905, he told his biographer, Pyotr Sergeyenko, that Dickens read beautifully and, quote, made a powerful impression with his dry but strong figure. He mentioned that he wanted to approach him to discuss with him the subject of education, because, of course, Dickens was very interested in social reform, but he was too shy. He was too shy of his English. So by far, the most important and well-documented meetings were between Tolstoy and Alexander Herzen, the radical and pro-Western thinker whose political and literary efforts helped lead to the emancipation of the serfs in Russia and influenced writers like Belinsky and Chernyshevsky. Herzen had been living in Britain since 1852. In 1861, when Tolstoy visited him, he had settled in Ortsted House near Paddington Station in what is now called Brunel House. Tolstoy had christened it the Worsted Courtyard. He recalled later how, at their first meeting, Tolstoy was surprised and even offended that Herzen did not invite him into his home, but instead immediately took him to a nearby restaurant of uncertain character. Not only that, but Herzen was not even wearing a hat, but only a flat cap instead of the cylinder hat that Tolstoy considered much more appropriate. In the restaurant, it seems they were approached by Polish political activists. Herzen was instrumental in the Polish uprising of 1863, to whom Herzen introduced Tolstoy, and for which interruption Herzen later apologized, citing his Russian tactlessness. However, despite the questionable restaurant, the lack of a cylinder hat, and the lack of tact, Tolstoy happily saw Herzen nearly every day. And from the letters Tolstoy addressed to Herzen, calling him the famous exile, it seems they spent a lot of time discussing political and social questions and the future of Russia. He had intended to share with Herzen the ideas he had for what would eventually become War and Peace. At the time, the novel was to be centered around a Decembrist who was returning to Russia in the year 1856, and he was eager to have Herzen's view on this socio-politically important subject. At Ortsted House, Tolstoy also met Herzen's longtime friend and colleague, Nikolai Ogarev, with whom Herzen ran the influential newspaper Kolokol and the Free Russian Press in London. The newspaper was printed in England and then smuggled into Russia. Interestingly, with Ogarev, it seems Tolstoy had been discussing not politics, but Goethe's Faust, and also music. And significantly, on the day that Tolstoy left London, March 17th, the Emancipation of the Serf Manifesto was published in the Russian Empire, a subject about which Tolstoy and Herzen continued to communicate long after Tolstoy's departure. So all of this sounds really great, right? He's visiting Herzen and Ogarev every day. He's spending hours occupied in the Kensington Museum. He possibly got to see his beloved Dickens speak, tour schools. And yet, after leaving London, Tolstoy writes in his journal the only description of London that he made during that time. London, nothing. Disgust with civilization. Now, this seems really unfair, right? It's a very damning observation. And I do think that Tolstoy's psychosomatic experience is not irrelevant here. His brother's death, toothache, lack of sleep, bad weather, definitely had something to do with it. Remember, he spent the first 8 days in London just languishing in pain. But there is one more thing that seems to have jarred and traumatized Tolstoy in London in a way that is surprisingly similar to how he was traumatized in Paris, and it again has to do with the public and violent treatment of a criminal. In 1896, Tolstoy told the Russian and Soviet pianist and musician Alexander Goldenweiser that when in London, he witnessed a harrowing sight. A criminal was being led by police through the crowd, and the crowd, in Tolstoy's words, threatened to tear him to pieces. This, as he says, astonished and disconcerted him, especially since, as he says, in Russia, the crowds tend to follow escorted prisoners with offerings of bread and money, regarding them as nесчастненькие, the little miserable ones. Now, this event is not recorded in Tolstoy's journals or letters at the time of his visit to London, and only surfaces in conversation with Goldenweiser nearly 40 years after the trip. Obviously, it's impossible to tell whether it or anything like it actually took place. What's striking, however, is the similarity between this event and what he saw in Paris. The criminal, the violence, the bloodthirsty crowd, and this rhetoric of total moral revulsion, at the treatment of human beings by a justice system regarded as enlightened. Recall, however, Tolstoy's use of the phrase "разорвать на части," tear to pieces, when describing to Botkin his initial shock at the spectacle of the guillotine. Tolstoy had written that seeing a man be torn to pieces would have been less horrifying than the cool efficiency of the machine. And then, 40 years after his trips abroad, he recalls the London crowd threatening to tear a criminal to pieces, using verbatim the same rhetoric. So it seems that, in some sense, the two capitals, Paris and London, merged in Tolstoy's mind as places where he expected to find, and then found, instances of hypocrisy and injustice that somehow were not as severe in Russia. It's helpful to consider that, in 1907, toward the end of his life, the industrialist Anatoly Demidov, in conversation with Tolstoy, praised the English love of progress and freedom, to which Tolstoy responded, "But they live at the expense of others. Their factories are just another method for living at the expense of others." So in other words, the efficient factories of London, just like the brilliance of the Kensington Museum, are a feature of what Tolstoy regards as the British mercantile or commercial tendency. And this inhumanity is evident not only in the way the English crowd treats its unfortunate prisoners, but also in all its institutions, including the education system itself. So in an unsent and undated letter to an unknown correspondent, and it's important because it's written sometime around the time of his visit to England, Tolstoy writes, "He's almost finished with his journey, and he's seen them, and is afraid to give not only myself, but the entire pedagogical world the conviction at which I've arrived after everything I've seen. Here it is. We, the Russian barbarians, we do not know, we hesitate, and seek solutions to the question of humanity's future and the best method of education. In Europe, these questions have already been resolved." He's obviously being very sarcastic here. "They know which science and which art are more or less useful for a particular subject. They know how many exercises for which part of the body are needed. They know which poetry is the best of all. They know that faith is the best." And then he describes what he saw in the schools. 100, 200 little boys walk in at a certain hour, pray, sit down on benches, and all 200 begin doing the exact same thing. So all you see is the face of bored students forcibly herded into the classroom. And we as educators, of course, is the last thing we want to see. So this notion of Russian barbarism compared to the civilized nature of Europe is a frequent theme for Tolstoy. And barbarism in this case is not an insult because it's contrasted with the sort of decadence that he sees in Europe. Russia for Tolstoy is barbaric in its ignorance, in its alleged lack of knowledge of what is true and right. But this ignorance means, first and foremost, that the nation is innocent. The English and French may not be barbaric, but this makes their violence less excusable. For Tolstoy, these nations are corrupt and decadent, which is precisely why their educational, governmental, and economic institutions are hypocritical and inhumane, producing obedient subjects that submit to sterile educational practices. So this disdain for Europe is why it's so strange that Tolstoy seriously considered emigrating there with his family on 2 separate occasions, specifically to England. So in a tragic incident in 1872, one of the bulls on Tolstoy's estate had gored one of the peasants, a shepherd. Tolstoy felt terrible and spent 3 days trying to revive the poor man. But what really got to him was the bureaucratic mess that ensued. He was put under house arrest while simultaneously being summoned to act as a jury for another court case. And when he failed to arrive owing to the house arrest, he was fined. And he was furious that a family man of his age, this is what he looked like at the time exactly, should be so mistreated. And immediately wrote to Alexander Tolstoy, his father's cousin and his lifelong confidant, that he had decided to emigrate to England forever, or until that time, that freedom and dignity for every person are guaranteed. And Sofia Tolstoy is very happy about this. She's an Anglophile. He has enough money. If he just sells everything, he'll have 200,000 rubles. And repulsed as he is, he says, by European life, I hope that I will cease to be angry, right? He plans to first settle somewhere near London and then find a beautiful and healthy spot somewhere near the sea. So he's happy about the prospect of settling in English countryside. Life in England will be pleasant. It's necessary to be acquainted with good aristocratic families. So he's asking her for letters of introduction. Now, fortunately, the case against Tolstoy was dropped, and his children did not have to attend those terrible, sterile schools in England that Tolstoy had so disapproved of. But I think that this hasty, melodramatic, and completely impractical decision demonstrates, better than almost anything else, that Tolstoy's complicated relationship with England specifically, and European culture generally, had always been very, very controversial or very contradictory. We see in this letter resonance with that youthful respect for the British soldiers that Tolstoy expressed as compared to the Russian counterparts due to their sense of dignity and civil liberty. Despite his criticism of the corruption and decadence of Europe, Tolstoy nevertheless regarded it as more conducive to a more liberal existence than what was possible in Russia at the time. Yet it was also, this letter shows that it was not a passing whim. A few years after the bull goring incident, in 1876, the Tolstoys were again considering emigrating abroad, perhaps settling in Italy, which Tolstoy observes in the letter is less repulsive, противно, to him than Germany. But ultimately, he concludes, I think that in Europe, I could live only in England. But people leave that country on account of their health. There's no reason to go there. He wrote that in a letter to Galachvastov in 1876. I think that just perfectly summarizes his attitude. So I tried to approach his travels in London not as an isolated biographical incident, but as an instance of a lifelong engagement with European culture that was both fruitful and contradictory. I tried to show how Tolstoy's visit to England was, in some sense, both a continuation and a conflation of his 1857 visit to Paris, which was itself an intensely intellectual, moral, emotional, and somatic experience. So while his attitude to England changed throughout his life, during 2 times of familial difficulty and personal crisis, Tolstoy turned to that particular country as a place of refuge and escape. Perhaps because in England he concentrated first a sense of the envy he felt as a young man toward the dignity of the individual, second, a sense of moral outrage that he felt when faced with European hypocrisy, but also the sense of intellectual awe that he experienced in the presence of great English writers and museums, resulting in a complicated combination of aversion and admiration, which is really the basis for all deep human attachment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sveta. Oh, sorry, my video is off. Thank you, Sveta, for your wonderful talk. It was really, really great. And I assume we have loads of questions. So if you have a question, just put it in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and start talking. And if I may, I have a brief remark. I think I was thinking about your said idea that Russia can be considered as rather innocent in terms of capital punishment, comparing to France and to England, but at the same time, the wars, if civil courts did not use capital punishment that often, at the same time, military courts use capital punishment very often, and Tolstoy was aware of it, and we can see the glances of this violence in his stories, such as, I don't know, Nikolai Palkin and Posle Bala. And you probably also know about his own participation in one of the courts in 1966 about this officer, Yutsevich and soldier Shabunin, and Tolstoy participated in this military court as a lawyer, trying to protect the soldier, but unfortunately he was murdered for not a very severe crime. He slapped an officer in his face, which obviously was considered as an awful crime, but probably, yeah, the punishment was quite severe. So I think Russia cannot be called innocent in any way, because military courts use this capital punishment quite a lot.
Thank you. I think that that's absolutely valid. And I wanted to say that, first of all, in terms of innocence, I'm using that concept to contrast that with civilization, right? So when I say that Tolstoy regards Russia as innocent, I mean that he regards it as barbaric. Varvarskaya strana. And for him, barbarism is something that's associated with a sort of primitive existence, right? So it's a society that hasn't yet passed through all the enlightening steps that you take in order to get to a contemporary civilization with all the proper liberal political reforms. So when I say innocent, I mean specifically in like a historical Hegelian sense. As for Russia's corruption and violence, I think Tolstoy was very much aware of that. So I'm treating a lot of this as this is rhetoric on his part, right? Obviously, he knows, and he was very much saddened and disappointed and personally involved with a lot of the terrible things that Russia was doing at the time. He himself was a victim to, one of the times that he was away from his estate, the Tsarist gendarmes came and they ransacked his estate looking for evidence of political and revolutionary activity. So he was very critical, deeply critical of Russian government. So I don't think that he actually thought that Russia was in any sense more innocent in a sense of inflicting violence, because he's also critical of their colonial practices in the Caucasus, for example. So that's, once again, I mean innocent in the sense of a historical, barbaric sort of innocence that is no longer evident in the decadence that you see in European culture.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your reply and your comment. So we have a few hands raised from Rebecca Beasley. So if you'd like to ask a question, please join us.
Thank you. That was great. Really, really interesting. Thank you very much. So you mentioned a few things about Tolstoy's interest in English literature, and I've got a kind of very specific question and one more kind of general question about that. And the specific question is about whether we know whether Tolstoy read Hard Times, because it was just so striking when you were describing the object lesson, and Hard Times begins with an object lesson. So I didn't know about that kind of connection, that Tolstoy had been critical of that specifically. And indeed, I didn't really know that Hard Times began with a kind of genre of teaching in quite that way. So that was the specific question. Then the more general question was just, how does Tolstoy's interest in English literature feed into this? And you mentioned at the end there's a bit of a tension where there's admiration on one side and less admiration on the other. So I wonder whether the kind of admiration side, whether you could kind of pull that out a little bit more.
Thank you. Well, as far as his admiration for Dickens, I think that's very well documented. Dickens was one of his favorite novelists. He praised him enormously. I know for a fact that he particularly liked Bleak House. I don't know exactly I'm sure it's very unlikely he didn't read Hard Times because he read, I think, pretty much everything by Dickens. And I think that he, part of the reason that he wanted to speak to Dickens actually about education was precisely because of what you mentioned, is that Dickens was obviously very much interested in the way that, obviously the plight of children, but also just social reforms and reforms in England and Europe at the time. So it's not, of course, it wasn't just Dickens, however, right? There are so many, like Thackeray as well, that he had hoped to run into. He was very, he loved so many different writers, not just European writers, that he was interesting because he's criticizing Germany, he's criticizing France, and yet he loves Goethe. He reads so many Balzac novels. There is this contradiction between what he sees as the art that civilization is able to produce, and yet the corruption, the decadence that he sees it's able to produce as well. So there is this tension for Tolstoy in the refinement of education and the nature and this kind of natural, simple living that it undermines, but also in the benefit that it can confer in terms of what the doors that it opens for, especially peasant children at the time, which of course at the time we have to understand that nobody was teaching peasant. This was crazy to people, right? They were looking at him saying, "What are you doing?" Like he freed his serfs long before the emancipation, and once he did, he's bringing these children into his home, and this was very controversial. It was very radical at the time. So obviously, he doesn't think that Russia should remain in a barbaric state, right? He doesn't think that. But on the other hand, I think he does think that it gives them a sort of I don't think, maybe he doesn't actually think it, it's part of his rhetoric to say so, but I think he gives it a sort of excuse. It sort of excuses some of Russia's violence because we're still, so to speak, in the cradle, right? So when we look back on, and he does write about this in other articles, that if you look at earlier, more primitive societies, we can excuse their violence because it's not state-sanctioned, centralized violence. It's a sort of innocent, primitive violence that it's natural and good to see that, right? Among, for example, the Cossacks or the Bashkirs or any of the other societies that he spends time with. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a raised hand from Lauren Maguire. Please join us.
Hello. Thank you so much, Sveta, for a really interesting, well-researched and entertaining talk. I absolutely loved it. To answer Rebecca's question, I'm trying, the stupid Zoom background is stopping me from showing you.
I was hoping you'd pull that out.
But I pulled out the master copy. It's my Yasnaya Polyana edition of all the books in Tolstoy's library. So I think we can say he did read Hard Times because he owned a copy, one of his beloved Tauchnitz editions, and he did bend back some of the pages according to the catalogue. So I think we can be confident he knew all about Mr. Gradgrind.
Thank you
so,
very much.
So Sveta, for you, I have two questions and a comment, if I can keep them straight after all this Dickensian excitement. So I have one quite general question. Really fascinating that Tolstoy reacted in this way to seeing executions in Europe. And Dostoevsky, as we know, was put onto the title character in The Idiot, seeing an execution in a very similar life-changing kind of way. In Dostoevsky's case, he was transferring his own experience of near execution. I can't recall now whether he actually saw somebody be executed for real or not. So what do you think about the different ways in which seeing executions influenced Tolstoy and Dostoevsky? So that's my first question. My second question is, I thought that your angle on Tolstoy's experiences abroad was really fresh and fascinating. So I just wanted to ask which sources you relied upon. Letters, Tolstoy's own diaries. I saw there was some biographers' reports as well. So I'm just curious to know to what extent you depended on Tolstoy's records as opposed to others. And thirdly, this is just a comment which may be my mistake. I thought I heard you say that the last execution in Britain happened in 1861, but I'm pretty sure it was not until the 1960s that people stopped being executed. So that could be me mishearing you. I'm sorry if that's the case. So if you could just clarify, I'd be very grateful. Okay, thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much for your questions. So I'll answer your last one first because it's the shortest. So the last execution, that was for attempted murder. So in 1861 was the last execution for attempted murder in England, at least according to my sources. So obviously there are more executions for other things, but for mere attempted murder, 1861 was supposedly the last time that happened in England. As far as witnessing execution, so it's interesting because Henry Troyat, in his biography of Tolstoy, says that Tolstoy wasn't actually upset by the execution at all, and he just wanted a dramatic excuse to leave Paris. He had already made plans to leave Paris, and he just wanted a reason to exit with the sort of, with a bang. And he wanted something to draw on, material to draw on for the rest of his life in terms of having like this traumatic event to refer to. There's no way to tell, obviously. You don't really know. Was he really traumatized by it? I mean, I certainly would think that he would have been traumatized by it. I don't know. He refers to it a lot, and he writes about it in multiple letters. He writes about it in his journals. He seems really genuinely tormented by it. He was, I think it's pretty well established that he was fairly honest in his journals. So I mean, it was very unlikely to me that it's all rhetoric. So yes, I think that he was deeply influenced by it. And I think that it went quite a long way to coloring his perception of European civilization, because as I tried to show, up until that point, he primarily had positive things to say. And then this event takes place, and suddenly it really, and he writes about it in his confessions, which I have right here. He writes about it, and he says that this is exactly when he saw that this I suppose sheen put on civilization was a lie, right? That in reality, there's this enormous amount of violence and corruption that is concealed beneath, the museums and, all the things that we take for granted when we think about civilization. And I think all of his comments about British colonialism, about Russian colonialism, I think they serve to show, and he continues to make these comments throughout the entirety of his life, that civilized states are not civilized. And he even at some point, I don't remember what the article is, but he's analyzing a very, I wish I remembered now. He was analyzing a tribe, and he was saying that when they go to hunt, for example, or to have the sort of like group on group violence, it's not the same thing at all as when these civilized countries go to do it, because for them it's a necessity. And it's, again, an instance of their sort of primitive innocence. Whereas here, this is like they should know better, in other words. So this displays not that they're, kind of fighting for survival, but more that they are fighting in order to establish power and dominion over innocent people, which, of course, for Tolstoy, the pacifist, this was always unacceptable. And so I really think that witnessing this execution kind of helped begin this trajectory, this lifelong trajectory of engaging with state violence and its lack of justification. As for Dostoevsky, so of course the difference is that Dostoevsky himself was almost executed. So I would imagine that seeing the crowd, seeing someone else, and then it happening to yourself is a very different sort of experience. Also, Dostoevsky was, of course, less less wealthy, less well connected than Tolstoy, which I think, you know, being sent to Siberia and being like, I think that kind of also showed, or I suppose that also influences how you experience being regarded as a criminal. So Tolstoy, he's obviously regarded as a criminal or put under criminal investigation when he was under house arrest. But of course, because of his connections, because he is like moving among the most elite circles, right? And Tolstoy's were like some of the wealthiest and most aristocratic families. He really can get away with almost anything, right? Dostoevsky, it wasn't quite as well connected. So I think that also. But as far as how does it manifest itself in his literature, I think it always did. I think that we always see this return to state violence as evidence of the corruption inherent in civilized life.
Thanks very much, Sveta. That's great. I don't think you answered my question about your sources, but that's
that's right. I'm sorry. I knew there was something else. The sources, yes. So aside from the Knowles article, there really isn't much information. I mean, the biographers they really gloss over this trip. So everything that I presented here was exclusively drawn from letters, his journal and diary entries, separate papers, and also from interviews that he gave throughout his entire life. So you notice that I quoted a lot of, there was Dolgenweiser Zblizi Tolstova, there were multiple, there's like a collection of texts from various people that visited Yasna Polyana in the 1890s that sat down to talk with Tolstoy. And he returned to the theme of his visit to London multiple times. And he was very consistent. He didn't vary, except for this one event where he supposedly saw this criminal being escorted by the police. It's the only time he mentions that. So I'm thinking maybe he made it up, but it's so odd that it followed exactly what he saw in Paris. So I don't know, maybe he just finally remembered it. So there's just really no way to tell. But yes, I relied exclusively on primary sources.
Thank you so much, Sveta.
Thank you, Sveta. We have a question from Marion Talbot in the chat. Shall I read it, or Marion will join us and ask the question herself?
Hi, Sveta. Thank you very much for your talk, which I enjoyed enormously. I think you said, and I may be wrong, that the mixture of admiration and aversion of the sort that Tolstoy felt towards England is the basis of all human relationships. And I was a bit taken aback at that. And if you did say that, can you tell me more about why you think that, please?
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, so I said that that's the basis, yes, of all deep human attachment. And yeah, I think that, I mean, maybe this is a very thoroughly Russian perception of things. But yes, I think that the deeper attached we are to a place or a person or an idea, the more complicated that attachment is. And I think there's always that mixture of being pulled and repelled. And I think that attachment is never purely one unidirectional, where I just, I love, I admire, and that's it. I think that any deep attachment requires deep intimacy, and deep intimacy, it's complicated. As Henry James says, deep experience is never peaceful. And I think that what that means is that love and pain and suffering, they're all very, very intermingled. And I think I'm getting a little philosophical here, but yeah, I think that especially reading, growing up reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy as I did, yeah, I don't think that, I think that deep attachment is always very complicated and very contradictory. So I think that just on that alone, we can say that Tolstoy, obviously, he says all these terrible things about England, and yet that is the place to where he turns when he's experiencing this personal and familial crisis. Why England? Well, because attachment is complicated.
Okay, that's interesting. I am a philosopher, actually, so you were indeed getting philosophical, and I think you need to answer that question. Thank you very much for your talk. I need to think more about that.
Thank you for challenging me on that. I shouldn't just throw away statements like that without giving them some thought.
It is a fairly major statement, I think, yes, but a very interesting one. I will think more about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a raised hand from Marina Uden. Would you like to ask a question?
Good evening. Thank you very much, Sveta, for your very exciting presentation. I've just got a brief comment was pleasantly surprised to notice that your analysis and your presentation, the focus of it, were echoed. I don't know if you are familiar with Lev Shestov's 1909 article, «Разрушающие созидающие миры», Destroyer and Creator of Worlds, where he, precisely similar to yourself, analyzes Tolstoy's later years and work. And his focus, like yours, is on those experiences of the executions in Paris and London. And I thought, you know, because you were not sure whether he was really upset or not, but you might want to read that article. It's available online in Russian. So he agrees that, Shestov, I mean, he agrees that Tolstoy was very disturbed by what he saw. And his later work, his stories that he wrote afterwards, were reflecting those experiences. So I just wanted to mention that. So it might help your further interpretation.
Thank you. I've heard of and read some Shestov, but I did not know about the existence of this article. Thank you. I will definitely look that up, because I think this is it comes up occasionally in Tolstoy studies, this idea of how much of his terror and his horror of what he saw was genuine, and how much of it was just, you know, literary rhetoric, because that's, you know, that's what he's a writer, that's what he's supposed to do. So I think it's a complicated question, and I would like to see how it's addressed in an extensive way. I think it should certainly form a part of a serious study. I think it would be worth it. Certainly. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. We also have a few more comments in our chat. So we have a comment from Ben. Ben, would you like to read your comment, or shall I do this? Well, I will read it then. Sveta, apologies if you already know this. You probably do. But Tolstoy's attitude to European Russian legal systems was pretty widespread among the left intelligentsia in the late 19th century. And among Russian immigrants, especially, the general view seems to have been that, as awful as the Tsarist state was, educated Russians had the decency to fight against its repressive practices, whereas their European counterparts acquiesced with their rulers. So thank you, Ben. Do you say that you are still mute? I can't hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly, again, whether or not he saw that event or not in England, that's certainly the case of after his experience in Paris. I think that's exactly what he's saying, is that, look, this terrible thing is happening, and the crowd is there, and they're raising up their children to participate in it. They're teaching their children to be, you know, interested in this. And when he recalls or makes up this memory of the London criminal, he says that in Russia, we feel pity for the criminals, right? We bring them bread, we bring them money. Whereas here, the crowd was trying to, you know, tear the man to pieces. And I think what's interesting here is that if we compare these two attitudes, let's say that this, again, this is getting philosophical here, but let's say it's true that the British crowd or the Parisian crowd wants to tear the criminal to pieces. I think that to some extent also shows that maybe they have more faith in their laws and their rulers, partly perhaps because they to some extent participate in making those laws, right? Because they are more liberal, because they are more democratic than Russia at the time, certainly, and even today, they have less animosity and feel less distance from the government and its actions. So if the Russian people are following the criminals and pitying the criminals, it's because they don't have any faith in the validity or the justice of their government, right? You could also say that. So it's a complicated question, but thank you, yes.
So I have a little question then. Do you think Tolstoy's attitude somehow to Britain and to British people changed after his pacifist ideas became so popular among the followers of his ideas, Tolstoyans in Britain? Because, as you know, there were so many of them, and obviously then Vladimir Chertkov moved to London and became basically one of the main Tolstoys, the leader of Tolstoy community in Britain. Tolstoy became even more aware of how popular his ideas, his pacifist ideas, his anti-government ideas were popular in the UK. So do you think his attitude to Britain and British people changed? And also so many followers came to Russia to visit his Yasna Polyana, like pilgrims to interview him, to ask their questions,
Of course.
etc., etc.
No, he had a lot of English people that he spoke to and spent time with. But I think, and some of the quotes that I drew from were in 1900 and 1905, when he was talking about British colonial practices, when he was saying that they're being hypocritical, they're being unjust, they're being, so I think he was always critical of British. What was that sound? Did I just of British foreign policy and British the hypocrisy that it displayed? But also, I think that, I mean, again, Tolstoy was he was a complicated man. He could interact with human beings just every day without necessarily blaming them or associating them with the government, right? So if he welcomed British people who came to see him or talk to him or interact with him on his estate, that does not mean that he was therefore incapable of, seeing the overall practices of state-sanctioned violence as somehow, he was able to disconnect the two, is what I'm saying. So he'd continue being critical of British behavior on the world stage, while simultaneously recognizing that every individual is an individual and to treat them as such. I think he always, I think, was consistent in that regard. But I also think that, when he first meets, for example, the English soldiers, and he sees them as sort of standing superior, I think that this idea, we see it also manifest to some extent in War and Peace, right? We see the enemy is thoroughly humanized in Tolstoy. I think, at least the way I read it, like you don't see the French soldiers as somehow, these inhuman monsters or barbarians. No, they're people that don't want to die, just the same way as the Russians are. So Tolstoy was always able to see the human side of any society, any civilization. So.
Okay, thank you for your reply. We'll also have an observation from Nick Hall. Would you like to read it? Yes.
Well, I can do, but it was, as I say, simply an observation. I know Berlin a lot better than Tolstoy, and it's striking how, for him, I think he was interviewed in the 90s by Michael Ignatieff, his biographer, and in that interview, he was still referring to witnessing a man being led by a mob through the streets of Petrograd as a sort of foundation of the emotional position behind all his intellectual work, anti-totalitarian, anti-violence, ostensibly, that kind of thing. And it was simply observing that, and how, I mean, I believe Berlin when he says that, but I also wonder and suspect if it became a rhetorical tool for him to deploy as an easy example of this thing that I despise. Here it is. Because I'm sure if you unpick his work more philosophically, he's not completely anti-violence, he's not completely consistent on this point, but biographically, it was very important to him. And that just came to mind when he brought that up.
Thank you. No, and I think that something can absolutely become a rhetorical, philosophical, political tool that has legitimate basis in actual events, of course. And this is why I tried to really focus on Tolstoy's emotional experience and also on his somatic experience. Again, this is something that's very much neglected. But I mean, I don't know about you, but when I travel, if I'm sick the entire time, I hate where I am. And that really does influence. And so he's having a lot. It's very, very complicated what he's feeling, and he's, all of this is affecting him. And we need to see it as, he's a human being in a human environment. He's not just this brain having these abstract thoughts. So we have to understand that a lot of his memories are, when he's comparing Russia to you, I think he wants Russia to be more innocent to some extent as well. I think that he wants to kind of be on the right side of history, so to speak. He wants Russia to, he says, one of the quotes that I consistently draw on for my thesis is, he says, if it's true that the Russians are barbarians, then it means we have a future, right? So for him, that means that if we're barbarians, that means that everything is still ahead of us. We're not decadent. We're not declining yet. That means we're still in our infancy. And that, I think that was a really important reference point for him, which is why, he goes back to Homer, he goes back to those, kind of illiterate, primitive civilizations, because they stand at the beginning rather than at the end of a civilization and its development. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sveta. And I think this idea of Russian special mission, Russian special way, it was also in the air at that time. And Tolstoy is just one of the representations of how his generation thought about it. So do we have any other questions? If anyone does, please just raise your hand or start talking. Or I think we have a question from Kathy McAteer. Would you like to ask it? Or yeah, it's just a comment to unmute and okay. For you with a toothache. It's like a virus spreading from Tolstoy. Okay, then I'll read it. Thank you for a fascinating talk, Sveta, delivered with a great confidence and the stimulating, elevated question and answers. On a frivolous note, I just love the idea of Herzen receiving Tolstoy in a flat cap. Yeah, that's amazing. A pity there is no photo. Yeah, probably someone should draw a portrait or something. Presumably Tolstoy chose not to transplant this fashion idea back to Russia. A light-hearted rhetoric question: has Russia missed out? Personally, I think Tolstoy would have looked great in one. Maybe he needed to adopt British attire for a more enjoyable. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I tried to kind of focus on some of these charming little elements that we sometimes miss out on. That, you know, Herzen took him to, you know, a restaurant instead of in his home, and he was wearing the wrong thing. And I also think he was writing after meeting all of them, and he left. He was writing to Herzen and telling him to tell Garov that he went to go see Faust to kind of continue their conversation. So that shows that they weren't just, you know, these, again, we try to think that these radical political activists. No, they were people talking about people stuff, you know.
Yeah, and indeed,
it's hard to think of them that way, but yeah.
Yeah, it is hard. Okay, Ben has a question, please. Unmute and yeah.
Hello, thank you once again, Sveta, for a really interesting talk. Just a very brief question. You mentioned Tolstoy talking to Herzen about his original idea for War and Peace when it was meant to be a novel about a sort of amnestied Decemberist coming back from Siberia. I was just wondering if you could maybe not necessarily now, but at some point just recommend me something to read on the sort of Decemberist origins of War and Peace, because it's something I've heard a lot about, but I've never really read anything specific about, and I would like to, because it's sort of relevant to something I was researching a while ago.
Sorry, can you hear me? I'm having so much trouble hearing you. I think I heard your question. You're asking for a recommendation of something to read on the early plans for War and Peace, I think.
Yeah, I can put it in the chat if that's easier.
Yeah, no, I think I can send you some stuff. I have an entire rolling bibliography for things. But yes, this was the idea for a very long time. And interestingly, War and Peace ends with the intent to continue. Obviously, you know, Pierre is going to go, and he's going to go and become the Decemberist. I think that it leaves on this note. There's supposed to be a sequel, and there never was. So, so this had been the plan all along. Obviously, it changed a lot through its development, and this is something that he regrets having not spoken to Herzen about this. Maybe and you know, maybe he would have later on anyway, but at the time he I suppose maybe was too shy. Again, maybe it was just like with Dickens. Maybe he was too shy.
I mean, I wonder whether he was. I know there's no evidence for this, but whether he was actually asking Herzen for source material that he could use, because at this time Herzen is publishing some of the Decemberist memoirs in emigration, and he's collecting a lot of sort of documentary evidence on the uprising in 1825. So that I guess might also have been something that they talked about. But if you could send me something to read on that would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I think there's actually an entire book dedicated to the novel that never was. So yeah, I'll send it to you.
I think it would be lovely if you can send some reading list for all of us, because there is another request from Marianne Talbot about a reading list. So if you can share some of your research, some of your reading list, it would be great.
Yeah, I'll add it to the chat. I just have to go through my bibliography, so just give me a few minutes. Should I just stop the video for myself and go do that really quickly, or should I?
So why don't we do it by email afterwards?
Okay, yes, that's better. Yeah.
And then everyone has it in their inbox and stuff.
Yeah,
rather than
sounds good.
You mentioned preparatory reading, so I wondered if it was available already somewhere. And
I have a reading list of just of work that I've consulted over the years,
okay,
which I can certainly share. But
wrong end of the stick. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Any other comments? Well, I think in case if there is no other question or comment, I think we can stop recording.
Yep.
You've stopped.